It was a crisp Monday morning when Officer Craig Fulton pulled his squad car into a quiet suburban neighborhood. Craig had been on the force for over 15 years, and while he carried himself as a dedicated protector of the community, there was a darker side to his approach to justice. Craig wasn't shy about profiling people. To him, a person's appearance often dictated their intentions, a mindset that had earned him whispered criticism among colleagues, but no real consequences, until now. That morning, Craig had received a call about a suspicious black man walking near a luxury neighborhood. No crime had been reported, just a vague concern from a nosy neighbor who didn't feel safe. Craig responded with the enthusiasm of someone convinced they were about to make an important bust. When he arrived, he saw a man standing near a sleek black sedan, casually scrolling on his phone. The man, dressed in a sharp navy suit and leather loafers, didn't fit the usual image Craig had conjured in his head. But Craig wasn't one to overthink. "Hey you, hands where I can see them," Craig barked, his voice sharp, commanding. The man looked up, startled but calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice measured. "You tell me," Craig shot back, stepping closer. "What are you doing here? You don't live around here, do you?" The man sighed, placing his phone into his pocket with deliberate care. "I'm waiting for someone." "Is that a crime?" Craig's instincts, or biases, kicked in. The polished suit and calm demeanor didn't matter. To him, this man didn't belong. He didn't bother asking for details. Instead, he demanded identification, ran a quick check, and when the man's record came back clean, Craig decided to press further. "Doesn't explain why you're here," he said. "Maybe we should sort this out downtown." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression incredulous. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Craig replied. Craig ignored the man's protests as he cuffed him and put him into the back of the squad car. To the officer, this was just another routine interaction, one that would end like so many others, with a quick trip to the station, an intimidating interrogation, and likely a minor charge to justify the hassle. He didn't see anything wrong with his actions. What Craig couldn't have known, what he didn't bother to check, was that the man sitting in his back seat wasn't just any well-dressed individual. He was Ethan Moore, a rising star in the federal justice system, a prosecutor with an impeccable track record, and someone who had spent years taking down corrupt officials, including officers like Craig. At the precinct, Craig continued his aggressive questioning, asking vague and leading questions, seemingly trying to trip Ethan up. But Ethan remained calm, answering only when necessary, a slight smirk betraying his growing amusement. "Why are you smiling?" Craig snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Because I know how this ends," Ethan replied, his tone steady. Craig ignored the remark, filling out paperwork as he prepared to send Ethan off to court on a baseless charge of obstruction. He didn't think twice about the consequences. After all, who was going to challenge him? But as the courtroom doors opened later that day, Craig's confidence started to waver. Ethan stepped forward, no longer the man in cuffs, but someone completely in control. The judge greeted him warmly. Craig frowned, confused. It wasn't until Ethan stood at the prosecutor's table, addressing the court with authority, that Craig's stomach dropped. The man he had profiled, arrested, and treated as a criminal wasn't just anyone. Ethan Moore was a federal prosecutor, and now he had the entire courtroom's attention. Craig felt his breath hitch as he watched Ethan take his place at the prosecutor's table. The man who'd been in handcuffs only hours earlier was now standing tall, his confident posture and composed demeanor making the officer feel increasingly out of place. Craig shifted uncomfortably, trying to piece together what was happening. The judge glanced at Ethan, then at Craig. "Mr. Moore, is there an issue we need to address before proceeding with today's cases?" Ethan smiled politely, his tone calm but deliberate. "Your Honor, there is an issue. One I believe requires immediate attention." He turned his gaze toward Craig, his expression neutral but unmistakably resolute. Craig's palms began to sweat. He wasn't used to being under this kind of scrutiny, especially not from someone like Ethan. He tried to keep his face impassive, but the nervous tapping of his fingers against his belt betrayed his unease. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Mr. Moore." Ethan took a step forward, his voice clear and measured. "Earlier today, I was unlawfully detained and brought here under false pretenses by Officer Fulton." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "I'd like to request a recess to present the full context of the events leading to my detainment." Craig's heart sank. He had expected a routine day, maybe some minor paperwork, but now he was standing in a courtroom where his every action was about to be dissected. He glanced at his fellow officers seated nearby, hoping for a sign of support, but most of them avoided his gaze. The judge frowned, clearly intrigued. "This is a serious claim, Mr. Moore. Do you have evidence to support it?" Ethan nodded, producing his phone from his pocket. "I recorded the entire interaction, Your Honor. For my safety, of course." Craig felt a cold wave of panic. He hadn't noticed Ethan recording anything, and now he regretted his every word and action from earlier that morning. He wanted to interject to explain himself, but his voice caught in his throat. The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. "Officer Fulton, step forward, please." Craig hesitated, then reluctantly moved to stand before the bench. His uniform suddenly felt constricting, the badge on his chest heavier than ever. "Officer," the judge began, her tone sharp, "is there any truth to Mr. Moore's claim? Did you detain him without cause?" Craig scrambled for a response, his mind racing. "Your Honor, I was responding to a call about a suspicious individual in the area," he said, his voice defensive. "I was just doing my job." "And did the suspicious individual exhibit any behavior that warranted an arrest?" Craig faltered. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't come. He didn't comply immediately, he offered weakly, grasping at straws. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, I provided my identification when requested and remained cooperative throughout the encounter." Officer Fulton's actions were based solely on assumptions. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "We'll review the recording during the recess. For now, Officer Fulton, I suggest you take a seat." Craig slumped into the nearest chair, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his badge shielded him from scrutiny. But now, sitting in the same courtroom where he testified against countless defendants, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. As the recess began, Ethan stepped out into the hallway, followed closely by a small group of reporters who had caught wind of the situation. Craig stayed seated, his mind drifting to his years on the force. He had always prided himself on being effective, but now he was starting to question what that actually meant. The minutes dragged on until the judge returned, signaling the end of the recess. After reviewing the evidence, she announced, her tone clipped, "I find Mr. Moore's claims credible. Officer Fulton, your actions today were deeply inappropriate and reflect poorly on this court and the justice system as a whole." Craig felt his stomach churn. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of a reprimand, and the public nature of it only made it worse. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. "This matter will be referred for further investigation," she continued. "And, Officer Fulton, I strongly recommend you reflect on your conduct before setting foot in this courtroom again." Ethan didn't gloat or smile. He simply gathered his things and walked out, leaving Craig to sit in the courtroom, drowning in his own thoughts. By the time the session ended, Craig's colleagues avoided him entirely. No pats on the back, no whispered reassurances, just silence. As he left the courthouse, he couldn't help but feel the walls closing in around him. But Ethan's day wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, eager to hear his side of the story. Ethan took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphones. "Today wasn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's about holding people accountable. No one should be judged by the color of their skin or treated as suspicious simply for existing. This isn't just a one-time incident. It's a systemic issue we all need to address." His words resonated, sparking conversations both in the crowd and across social media, where the story was already trending. Ethan's calm demeanor and eloquence struck a chord, turning him into an unexpected advocate for justice reform. Craig, meanwhile, watched the news coverage from the solitude of his car. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt about the path he'd chosen and the decisions he'd made. As the sun set on the courthouse, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would force Craig to confront his own biases and challenge the very foundation of the system he had sworn to serve. The question wasn't just what would happen to Craig, but whether he was capable of change, or if he'd remain a relic of a broken system. Ethan sat in his office later that evening, the soft hum of the city filtering through the windows. His desk was cluttered with case files, notes, and a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Despite the chaos of the day, he couldn't stop replaying the courtroom scene in his mind. The look on Craig's face, the judge's stern reprimand. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, but something heavier. Today had been a reminder of the uphill battle he'd been fighting his entire career. Across town, Craig was nursing his own thoughts. The usual camaraderie of his precinct had been replaced with an awkward silence. Some of his colleagues barely acknowledged him as he walked through the station. He couldn't tell if it was judgment or fear that they might be next under the microscope. Either way, the isolation stung. Craig retreated to his small apartment, dropping his keys on the counter and collapsing onto the couch. The news played in the background, Ethan's name scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Clips of the courthouse confrontation aired on repeat, accompanied by heated debates between pundits. Craig turned it off, unable to face himself reflected in their words. Meanwhile, Ethan's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls, texts, and emails. Activists, reporters, even old friends from law school were reaching out. Everyone had an opinion or a request. Some wanted him to speak at rallies, others wanted to share their own experiences. Ethan knew this could be a turning point, but the weight of it all was exhausting. His assistant Mia knocked lightly on his door before stepping in. "You need to eat something," she said, placing a sandwich on his desk. Ethan glanced at her, grateful for the gesture. "Thanks, Mia, I'll get to it." She hesitated before sitting down across from him. "How are you holding up? Really?" He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine, just tired. This feels bigger than me, you know. It's not just about what happened today. It's about everything. Every person who's been in my position but didn't have the platform to fight back." Mia nodded. "It is bigger than you, but that's why it matters. You're in a position to make people listen." As the days passed, the story continued to gain traction. Ethan found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't asked to lead. Interviews, community meetings, and endless conversations consumed his time. Each interaction reinforced the systemic issues he had always known existed but now felt an urgency to address. For Craig, life became increasingly uncomfortable. An internal investigation had been launched, and he was temporarily reassigned to desk duty. The whispers and side-eyes at the precinct were relentless. He thought the badge would shield him from scrutiny, but now it felt like a target on his back. One evening, Craig found himself scrolling through the comments section of a news article about the case. He wasn't sure why, maybe morbid curiosity, maybe a desperate search for validation. But the comments were brutal. People called him names, questioned his character, and demanded his resignation. A few defended him, arguing he was just doing his job, but even those rang hollow. Feeling restless, Craig decided to take a walk. The city felt different now, more hostile. Or maybe it was just his perception. As he wandered aimlessly, he found himself near a community center where a town hall meeting was taking place. A small crowd had gathered outside, some holding signs demanding police accountability. Curiosity and an inexplicable pull led him inside. He kept to the back, blending into the shadows as Ethan took the stage. Ethan spoke with the same calm confidence Craig had seen in the courtroom. He shared his story but also highlighted others, stories of individuals whose voices had been silenced. He didn't name Craig, but the implications were clear. As Craig listened, he felt a strange mix of defensiveness and shame. He wanted to believe he wasn't the villain in this narrative, but he couldn't ignore the truth in Ethan's words. After the meeting, Craig lingered outside, unsure why he hadn't left yet. He watched as Ethan mingled with attendees, shaking hands and answering questions. Craig debated approaching him but hesitated. What would he even say? Before he could decide, Ethan spotted him. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Ethan walked over, his expression unreadable. "Officer Fulton," Ethan said, his tone neutral. Craig shifted awkwardly. I just wanted to listen," he said finally. Ethan studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's a start." Craig wasn't sure if it was an olive branch or a challenge, but either way it left him thinking. The encounter lingered in both their minds, each man grappling with his own perspective. Ethan couldn't ignore the possibility that Craig might genuinely want to change, while Craig couldn't shake the realization that maybe, just maybe, he needed to. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths were on a collision course that would force both to confront uncomfortable truths and the systemic forces that had shaped their lives.